We are joined today from Paris by Mr. Maher Nicolas Firzli, the director of the EU ASEAN Center, and from Cairo by Mr. Mohamed Osman, the international relations specialist. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining me today. Let me start with Mr. Osman. Kaja Kallas stressed that any U.S. agreement must include the EU and Ukraine. How can Europe, sir, make sure it is not sidelined in these talks, given the significance of a meeting between Trump and Putin? And what are you expecting from this ministerial meeting?
Thank you for having me, Selma. Greetings to you and to your honorable guest, and to the dear audience, of course. The short and direct answer to your question is that there are no guarantees that the Europeans will not be sidelined. If anything, they are actively being sidelined by both Washington and Moscow in this process. It seems that the United States is not eager to include many other stakeholders in the negotiations with the Russian side in order not to complicate and to reach what the United States sees as a settlement that is suitable for their vision, and that is at least freezing the conflict in Ukraine. Even if they are not able to achieve a sustainable peace, then maybe they can stop the hostilities so that they can stop the bleeding of U.S. resources in the Ukrainian conflict and divert them elsewhere. President Trump is running a foreign policy on a mandate of spreading peace, or so he claims. His record in this regard over the past 8 months has been far from pristine. It's very questionable. The results of his policies are rather very negative. He had failed to achieve peace in Ukraine or the Middle East, for example, the hottest conflict spots on the planet at the moment. So it seems he is eager to push forward some sort of negotiations with the Russians. The Russians called his bluff when he issued an ultimatum, and when he pledged more weapons to Ukraine, they did not stop. The Russians are advancing around, and Putin basically has the cards, all the cards in his hand, or at least most of them. So on the negotiating table in Alaska in a few days, I think that the Russians will be in a much better negotiating position than the Americans. It is reported that even informed the Europeans that you will have to accept the outcomes of these negotiations eventually. However, we should not get ahead over ourselves, because this summit has a very high degree of succeeding in achieving some breakthrough, yet the obstacles and the hurdles are very significant, and they might not there's a very strong possibility that this summit might not deliver anything as well.
Like what obstacles, for example, Mr. Mohamed?
Obstacles because the Russians are now putting forward maximalist demands. Reportedly, Witkov, who's turned out to be a very lousy negotiator, whether in the Middle East or in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, misunderstood what President Putin told them in the previous meeting they had. President Putin told them the Ukrainians have to withdraw from all the annexed Ukrainian oblasts, the 4 of them, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson. Witkov misunderstood that and went to the Americans telling them, the Russians are ready to withdraw from 2 of those oblasts. Apparently there was a misinterpretation of Putin's words. The Russians told them, no, we're telling you that the Ukrainians have to get out, no NATO membership, and also the downsizing of Ukraine's military capabilities. If the Russians insist on that, and they will insist on that most probably, the Americans will have only 2 choices: either to acquiesce to these demands and basically throw Ukraine and Europe under the bus, or disagree with them and continue this conflict in perpetuity. So there are very, very strong obstacles, but of course we do not know what's in Trump's mind, and no one can predict what he might do to the Russians.
Mr. Firzli, the Alaska Trump-Putin meeting could reshape the security balance in Europe. How do you think can the EU strengthen its influence ahead of such high-level talks, in your opinion?
Well, quite frankly, I think the European Union's options are very limited. Why is it limited? For a simple reason: is in 4 days we have the Anchorage summit in Alaska between President Trump and President Putin, but there's something much more important for the future of Ukraine and Russia and the world, which happened in Scotland 2 weeks ago. So what happened in Scotland 2 weeks ago, it happened in Aberdeen,
Yep.
and it didn't happen in a government office or a government-owned building. It happened at a golf club, at a private golf club owned personally by the Trump family in Aberdeen, Scotland, named after the grandmother of President Trump. And what happened 2 weeks ago, Ursula von der Leyen, the quote-unquote supposedly all-powerful head of the European Commission, supposedly, according to her, the European Union was stronger than Russia, much stronger than America, blah, blah, blah. She went to Aberdeen 2 weeks ago and she kneeled before Trump. And so she made enormous economic, financial, military, industrial concessions in just half an hour.
Okay.
And Trump came out of the Aberdeen summit
Yes.
as the winner. And so after that,
Yes.
it went downhill. It went downhill for Europe because in that sort of geopolitical, geo-economic balance of power, it became clear to the world, including to China and Russia, that Europe was not what it claimed. It is not a superpower. And so they yielded to Trump. Something very interesting. Today, who is meeting in downtown Brussels, the seat of the EU Commission
Yes.
and the European Council? Foreign ministers. So you have 7 or 8 foreign ministers who flew to Brussels today. What does it tell you? Foreign ministers are 1 or 2 notches below presidents, prime ministers, etc. So the level, the rank of the people meeting in Brussels today is a mid-level rank.
Yep.
What is it telling us? It's not an important meeting.
Mr. Osman, the EU statement reiterated that international borders must not be changed by force. How should the EU approach the issue of territorial gains, given that the US seems to be lenient with the Russian demands regarding the annexed territories?
First of all, I would like to fully agree with what Mr. Firzli has said, and I really admire his choice of words and his very descriptive approach of what transpired between the Americans and the European, or Ursula von der Leyen and Trump. And when it comes to the idea of the territorial integrity of the Ukrainians and the Europeans making noise about it, of course, in principle, they are entitled to speak about this. They are entitled to speak of the unity of Ukrainian territories, international law, territorial integrity of Ukraine. You know, it all rhymes with international law, but the newsflash, international law does not matter anymore. We are not in a rules-based order anymore. Arguably, we were never really in a rules-based order. Rules and laws were made to be obeyed by the weak and applied by the strong. The Europeans finally are now realizing that they are not the power they thought they were. They were mistreated by the Americans. And before that, when they were visiting Beijing, Ursula von der Leyen herself and the leaders of the European Union, they were mistreated by the Chinese. And basically, the summit was cut short and they were asked to leave because of the position on Ukraine and how they were blaming China for supporting Russia, or accusing China of supporting Russia in this regards. So they can make all the noise they want, but they cannot do anything on the ground to change the realities or alter them in any ways. Russia has the upper hand in the battlefield. Russia has persevered, and it took in all the sanctions and absorbed them, and they managed to survive and actually win this war on the battlefield. As we can see right now, the last cities of Donetsk are about to fall. Pokrovsk the fighting is within the strategic city of Pokrovsk itself. In Minograd, on the outskirts of Seversk, these cities are about to fall. Most likely, next stage would be Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, and then it's over. The Russians control eastern Ukraine. So now the Russians are advancing. They have the cards in their hands. The Europeans claim all the time that they can block or fill the deficit made by the absence or the reduction of military arms, U.S. military arms supplies to the Ukrainians. They can't. They are lying. And the Russians basically have the upper hand in the field.
Yeah.
And the Americans are not supporting or are not providing unconditional support to the Ukrainian side anymore, or the Europeans.
Mr. Firzli, Zelensky insists that any talks without Ukraine are useless and decisions against peace, as he says. How can the EU stand firmly with Kiev, and how does Washington view this stance, do you think?
Well, actually, when Zelensky speaks and when Ursula von der Leyen or Emmanuel Macron speak, they speak from the same page. So actually, they're reading the same talking points. So it's not like the Ukrainians are recommending something to the Germans or the French are telling something to the Ukrainians. It's not true. This is fiction. They are speaking from the same talking points. What are these talking points? For short, they are called the neoconservative talking points. So the world, they're clinging. So what they're doing in Europe and Ukraine, they're clinging desperately to a world which died in February of this year. Because when President Trump entered the White House 7 months ago, that old order, that sort of Bush, George Bush, Dick Cheney, Tony Blair, Hillary Clinton world, it collapsed. It no longer exists. But in Europe, in Berlin, Brussels, Paris, and in Kiev, they're desperately clinging to the old world. Why has the old world died? Not only because of Putin and Trump, it's because also in China, in India, in Saudi Arabia, in most of the world, they don't believe in the George Bush, Dick Cheney neoliberal agenda. So the only ones in the whole world believing in the Cheney-Bush agenda called neoconservatism are the poor EU Commission and the Ukrainian government. So it's really sad because when you listen to them, they almost live in the past. They don't want to realize that the world has changed. And why the world changed? Why geography, right? Who chose Alaska? It's not Putin, it's Trump chose Alaska. So why Alaska? Because Trump believes there's a new great game, and he's right. What is the new great game? It is the techno-industrial rivalry pitting China against America. This is the new great game. And the others don't really matter. So the European Union, Ukraine, they don't matter. Russia is important both in the eyes of the Chinese and the Americans because Russia, just like India, just like Egypt, is a pivot nation. So in that new great game, pitting Washington against Beijing, there are only 5 or 6 geographically located pivot nations. And the most important pivot nation is Russia because of its size and location. And of course, because he believes that now America should focus relentlessly on the economic techno-industrial rivalry with China, Trump does not want to antagonize the Russians. He doesn't want to push the Russian in the arms of the Chinese. And that is driving his policy. But the problem is the Europeans and the Ukrainians refuse to see reality. And that's why they come up with unrealistic, completely silly and shallow demands. It's not fair. We want Zelensky to go to Anchorage, Alaska. Trump is not allowed to, who are they? Who are they to say Trump is not allowed to meet Putin in Alaska? It's crazy.
Mr. Osman, some fear that the Alaska summit could actually bypass the EU demands entirely, altogether. What options do you think does Brussels have to ensure it remains an active decision maker rather than a bystander?
Well, Salma, they do not fear being bypassed. They know very well that they are being bypassed and completely ignored in this calculus. That's why the Ukrainians and the Europeans have communicated with the Americans and presented, according to President Zelensky, their own scheme for a peaceful resolution of the Ukrainian conflict, for a settlement. And again, it is laughable and so departed from reality. Why? Because it stipulates the following, according to several reports in the European and the American media. They say that they want the Americans and the Europeans to provide Ukraine with guarantees that they will not recognize Russian suzerainty over any of the lands they acquired in Ukraine, including Crimea, which they captured in 2014, way before this war. They also say that they refused abandoning the idea of joining NATO, maybe in the distant future, but they refused to present some sort of guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality. And of course, they reject the idea of limiting Ukraine's defense capabilities. If anything, they are calling for guarantees and massive armaments of Ukraine's military capabilities and their enhancement. Of course, each and every of these demands or suggestions will be flatly rejected by the Russians, and probably most of them will not be accepted by the Americans as well. The Americans under the Trump administration, they do not believe or agree to the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. They do not care about Ukraine being a bulwark of European stability and whatnot. They do not really care about that. They do not even care about any perceived Russian threat against Europe. If anything, the Americans are very content with Russia being a menace to the Europeans so that they can milk them for more money, more resources, more weapons that they can buy from the Americans. So it is very beneficial for the American military-industrial complex for Russia to be the demon that, or the boogeyman that scares the Europeans all the time. And as for the settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, I think that the Americans want to settle the conflict in a way that is conducive to their own interests. There is always the question of trying to separate Russia from China. As Mr. Maher said, Russia is a pivot state. It is a great power as well, and it borders China, and it is currently aligned with China. Trump explicitly said that he wishes to unravel this partnership and try to wean Russia away from China and draw closer to the Americans. I don't think this is going to happen. I think at this moment the Russians are way smarter than to actually try to affect in any way or spoil in any way their very strong partnership with the Chinese. It's completely unrealistic. So this might actually be the sticking point that might be a very strong hurdle in these negotiations. However, the Alaska summit is very important, Salma, and there is another summit next month, potential summit that might be equally important or even more important. China invited President Trump to attend the 80th anniversary of Chinese victory over Japan in World War II. Okay. And in this 80th anniversary, many world leaders have been invited from the global south, and President Putin has been invited too. Probably he will attend, and President Trump did hint that he might attend the Beijing summit. So if Xi Jinping, Russia, and the United States, Xi Jinping, Putin, and Trump meet in Beijing, we might be looking at a new Potsdam conference or a new Yalta conference that will redraw the global world order, basically. It will completely redraw it. And who is not on this table, as you can see explicitly? The Europeans, Salma. So the Europeans, unfortunately, are screwed, and they have no other option than to be either yield or become crybabies and keep complaining and nagging everyone about the loss of stature that they are suffering right now.
Mr. Firzli, now that the EU plans to accelerate arms deliveries, regardless of the Alaska summit's outcome, according to the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, what risks or opportunities do you think this could bring?
Well, the problem is it's purely verbal. So I fully agree with Dr. Mohamed Osman. It's ridiculous, it's foolish, and it's purely theatrical because, honestly, military infrastructure, to build it and to expand it, we're talking about investment cycles of 5, 10, 15 years. So why can Russia today produce a lot of missiles and bombs and drones? Because they have invested steadily in their military infrastructure. The Europeans, until 2-3 years ago, were mocking the Russians, saying, ha ha, they're so stupid, the Russians, they're wasting money on rusty missiles. We, the Europeans, are smart. And now the joke is on them. So now they say they will double or triple the number of ammunition and missiles they will send to Ukraine. It's a lie, because to double or triple, it's a 15 years investment cycle. The war will likely be over in 2 months. So when the war is over in 2 or 3 months max, and you say to the Ukrainians, don't worry, we're going to double our production of missiles in the next 20 years, it is a lie. But agreeing with Mohamed Osman, I want to say the following.
Okay.
One of the big problems with, big propaganda or self-delusion, they are deluding themselves, right? One of the big issues we face in Europe and Ukraine today is they're saying, we represent the value-based order. We represent democracy. Trump is not a democrat. He's an authoritarian leader, blah, blah, blah. So this is completely delusional for a simple reason. Let's look at Ukraine. When did Eastern Ukraine, the reason why there's a war today, right? And this is the part of Ukraine, 20% of the land in the east, the Eastern Oblast, which Trump is now saying we should return to Russia as the price to pay to end the war. These oblasts, these provinces, when did they become Ukrainian? In 1954, when a dictator, a cruel communist dictator named Nikita Khrushchev, in June 1954, and Nikita Khrushchev, he was not Russian. He was the president of a government called the Soviet Russian government, but he was an ethnic Ukrainian. And so abusively, illegally, completely illegally, that Ukrainian dictator, Khrushchev, in June 1954, he removed these provinces and he removed Crimea away from Russia and he gave them to Ukraine without, against the will of the people who lived there, like a good dictator. So who is the Democrat? Where is democracy? So what the Europeans are saying today is we should abide by the border drawn illegally by a Soviet communist dictator who transferred these cities, these villages, these people away from Russia. And they had been part of Russia for more than 800 years. It illegally moved them to Ukraine. And now the EU is saying, oh, democracy, blah. No, it's not true. This is not democracy.
Mr. Osman, Kallas warned against deals that could be a springboard for further aggression. What kind of security arrangements or guarantees do you think could prevent that from happening?
I don't think it's going to happen to begin with. I think Kaja Kallas is delusional. As you know, she used to be the prime minister of, I don't remember, Lithuania or Estonia. And she is one of those people suffering, European leaders suffering from Russia derangement. Of course, the Baltic states suffered under the yoke of the Russians, whether under the Tsars or under the Soviet Union, for centuries. And even when they were briefly independent for a few years, they were reoccupied by the Soviet Union in the mid-20th century. So I do understand what she fears. But now these countries are members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a military alliance that has a clause in its charter about collective defense. Russia would never dare attack a NATO country, not Poland, not Estonia, not Latvia, not Lithuania. This is nonsense. These are pure lies that the Europeans are spreading. It's basically a campaign of fear-mongering to convince their voters that they are in danger so that they would vote for them and support their policies that call for the escalation with Russia. I don't think this is true. I don't think that this reflects reality. Russia would never attack a NATO country. The war in Ukraine could have even been prevented, but it was not because, and of course, I'm not justifying Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was illegal according to international law. However, it was provoked. It was not an unprovoked war like President Biden used to say, or what the European leaders like to say. It was definitely provoked by the idea of NATO expansion since the year 2005, when the idea of the expansion of NATO and Ukraine and Georgia, two countries that were traditionally in the Russian sphere of influence and that were even part of the Russian state for centuries ago, to join NATO, and basically presenting or posing a very strategic threat to the heartland of Russia. So this is something, of course, that the Russians were never going to accept, and they provoked this war. And now the European public, huge segments of them are very tired of this war and are blaming their governments for how they are conducting themselves around it. I think that NATO is a guarantee, a very strong guarantee, that will always deter Russia from attacking any NATO country. We will not see Russian tanks in Poland. We will not see Russian missiles hitting Germany. We will not see Russian soldiers in Riga, for example. This will never happen. This is preposterous, and they know that they are lying. It's all about the idea of preserving this a colonial mentality of the European, this idea that we are the victorious side, that we have vanquished the Soviets and the Russians in the Cold War, and we should always remain, have the upper hand. This neoconservative mentality that Mr. Firzli has mentioned, which of course was orchestrated by the Americans, does not exist anymore. Like, the owners of the idea do not believe in it anymore. So when you try to play along with it and you try to push it forward, you just can't without US support. And as far as we know, they made Trump very content with their increase in defense spending to 5% of the GDP as part of NATO.
Unfortunately, we are running out.
Trump will stay committed to NATO, so they should not.
Unfortunately, I'm running out of time. And that was Mr. Mohamed Osman, the International Relations Specialist, and Mr. Maher Nicolas Firzli, the Director of the EU ASEAN Center. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your insights.